You call this cold? You really don't know what you're talking about. Sergeant Ryker laughed, exhaling a cloud of steam that drifted into the icy air like a ghost. His alien comrades stared at him in disbelief. They shivered uncontrollably, wrapped in layers of advanced thermal gear that groaned under the strain of keeping them alive. To them, the temperature on this frozen moon was unbearable, even deadly. But Ryker, a human from a planet they'd learned was notorious for being one of the harshest in the galaxy, acted as if the biting cold was a mere inconvenience. "How are you not frozen solid?" sputtered Kriv, his scales turning a darker hue as his body struggled to maintain warmth. The Zerulean's eyes darted nervously between Ryker and the snow-covered wasteland stretching out before them, his breath catching in his throat as another gust of wind tore through the group. Ryker shrugged nonchalantly, the snow crunching under his boots as he shifted his weight. "Where I come from, we call this sweater weather," he said, grinning. The baffled group of alien cadets exchanged glances, clearly not understanding how the human could be so calm. The mixed-species cadets were in the middle of a survival exercise on Iska V, a moon infamous for its brutal winters and relentless storms. It was a standard test at the Galactic Military Academy, designed to push each species to their absolute limits. For most of the recruits, this was already too much. "Sweater weather," another cadet, Kor, a feathered Ragan, repeated in disbelief. His feathers puffed up in a desperate attempt to conserve body heat, but he trembled with every breath. "We're lucky if our gear lasts another hour in this." Riker's face remained relaxed, showing no sign of discomfort. "Dead serious," he replied. His cheeks had barely flushed, and his breathing stayed steady despite the frigid, thin air. "Humans are built for this kind of thing. You should see the winters back on Earth. Now those are brutal." Kor blinked, his wide eyes struggling to stay open against the stinging wind. "Why aren't your fingers and toes falling off?" Ryker raised an eyebrow, genuinely confused. Why would they? He glanced down at his standard-issue cold weather gear, which was far less advanced than the intricate thermal suits the others were wearing. The group exchanged nervous glances, unsure if Ryker was joking or just completely insane. Zarn, a towering insectoid creature, clicked his mandibles in frustration. "This isn't possible. My kind is engineered to withstand extreme heat, yet even with advanced tech, I'm barely functional. And you're just fine?" "Look," Ryker began, gesturing to the distant ice-covered mountains shimmering on the horizon. "This might feel unbearable to you, but humans have been dealing with worse for millennia. Ice ages, sub-zero blizzards, you name it. Cold is just another problem to solve. You adapt, find ways to keep warm, and keep moving." Another icy gust ripped through the group, forcing several of the alien cadets to stumble. Ryker, however, remained unfazed. "You adapt?" Kor repeated, incredulous. "How could anyone possibly adapt to this?" Ryker chuckled. "It's simple, layers and good circulation. Some places on Earth are like this year-round, no big deal. Well, maybe a little bit of a problem, but nothing we can't handle." Zarn shuddered, pulling his cloak tighter around his body. "But you're not wearing anything special. Just standard gear like the rest of us." Ryker smirked, adjusting his gloves. "Yeah, well, that's because I'm from a death world, remember? Earth's got its fair share of nasty conditions, and cold is just one of them." Zarn's mandibles twitched in disbelief. "This is just one." Ryker nodded, rubbing his hands together. "One of the easier ones, actually. Cold is predictable. You know it's coming, so you prepare for it. The real dangerous stuff back home? You never see it coming." Kor groaned, his feathers drooping further under the weight of the snow. "This is easier? You think this is cold? Wait until you hear about frostbite," Ryker said with a chuckle. Zarn grimaced, clearly not wanting to know more. "How can you be so calm?" Gura, a massive beast-like creature covered in thick fur, growled. "This isn't just cold, it's deadly." Ryker shrugged again, his breath forming misty clouds. "It's all about mindset. We've dealt with worse. So yeah, this isn't so bad." The group trudged on, the wind howling around them. The alien cadets had been warned about human resilience, but witnessing it firsthand was something else entirely. Ryker wasn't boasting. To him, This really was nothing more than a minor annoyance. "You're insane," Zarn muttered, though there was a hint of admiration in his voice. Ryker grinned. "Nah, just human." The sun barely hung above the horizon, casting a pale light through the thick clouds, offering no warmth. Every breath the alien cadets took seemed to freeze in their lungs, their bodies stiffening with each step. But Ryker moved with ease, occasionally glancing back at his struggling comrades. "Keep moving," he called out, his voice steady. "Sitting still is what gets you. Stay active, keep the blood flowing." "We've been walking for hours," Kriv gasped. "How much further?" Ryker checked his wrist device. "Not much further. There's an old research station over that ridge. We'll get you warmed up." The group pressed on, every step heavier than the last. The storm intensified, swirling snow reducing visibility to almost nothing. Ryker stopped, scanning the white expanse ahead. "Storm's picking up. We need to move faster," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. Kor stumbled, his wings dragging in the snow. I don't think I can make it." Ryker stepped over to him, steadying the wagon with a firm grip. "You can. Just one foot in front of the other. You're stronger than you think." As they neared the ridge, the alien cadets were on the verge of collapse, their bodies pushed to the limit. But Ryker remained their rock, guiding them with calm determination. "There," Ryker said, pointing to a structure barely visible in the distance. "The station's just beyond that ridge. We're almost home." Zarn blinked through the flurries, his vision blurring. He could just make out the outline of the station. Relief washed over him. "We're gonna make it." Ryker flashed a confident grin. "Of course we are. Now let's get you inside before you freeze solid." The storm roared around them, but the promise of warmth and Riker's unyielding confidence drove them forward. They weren't finished yet. The wind howled louder, a relentless force that clawed at the group as they made their way up the final ridge. Snow whipped across their faces, stinging like shards of glass, and visibility was reduced to a mere few feet. Ryker led the way, his eyes scanning the landscape as if he could see through the thick white wall that surrounded them. The research station was close, but the storm was intensifying, threatening to bury them before they could reach safety. "Almost there," Ryker called over his shoulder. His voice remained calm, even as the situation worsened. His breath formed misty clouds that quickly vanished into the swirling snow. The alien cadets struggled behind him, their movements sluggish and unsteady. Kriv's legs wobbled, as if they were no longer his own. He could feel his muscles locking up, his scales almost numb to the point of paralysis. His mind screamed at him to stop, to collapse into the snow, but Riker's voice kept him moving, a faint light in the dark tunnel of his thoughts. Kor, barely able to keep upright, clutched his wings close to his body, trying to conserve what little warmth he had left. His feathers had lost their iridescent sheen, now dull and coated with frost. Each step felt heavier than the last, like he was dragging boulders through the snow. "We're not going to make it," Kor gasped, his voice weak, barely audible over the storm. His vision blurred as his body screamed for relief. "We can't." "Yes, you can," Ryker said, his voice cutting through the blizzard like a lifeline. "You're stronger than you know. Don't think about the cold. Think about each step, one after the other." Zarn's mandibles clicked nervously. He could feel his body shutting down, his normally sharp reflexes dulled to the point of uselessness. His kind was built for heat, not this frozen nightmare. His mind wandered to his homeworld's burning deserts, where survival depended on shielding yourself from the sun, not fighting the cold. "Ryker!" Zarn's voice broke, his tone filled with desperation. I can't feel my hands. My systems are failing." Ryker slowed his pace, falling back to walk beside the towering insectoid. He gave Zarn a firm pat on the shoulder, guiding him forward with a steady hand. "You don't need to feel them right now. Your body is still working. You just have to keep going, Zarn. Focus on the station. It's right over this ridge." Zarn blinked, his vision unfocused, but he nodded. Riker's calm confidence was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. If the human could keep moving, then so could he. As they reached the crest of the ridge, the storm howled in its full fury, nearly knocking the cadets off their feet. Ryker planted his boots firmly, shielding his eyes from the blowing snow. And then, through the whiteout, he saw it, the faint outline of the station, half buried in snow but still standing. "There it is," Ryker shouted, pointing toward the dark shape in the distance. "We're almost there." The others could barely see it, but the sight of the structure was enough to reignite a flicker of hope. Gura, the massive fur-covered grox, let out a low growl, more a sound of determination than frustration. His hulking form had slowed considerably, his fur matted with ice and frost. He grunted with effort, pushing his body to keep moving. I can't believe it's real," he muttered, his deep voice strained. Ryker nodded, his grin hidden behind the thick scarf wrapped around his face. "It's real. We'll get inside, warm up, and you'll all feel a lot better in no time." They began their descent down the other side of the ridge, the station growing closer with each step. The snow was deep, making each movement a battle, but the promise of warmth drove them forward. Suddenly, Kor stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him. He fell into the snow, his wings limp at his sides. Ryker was at his side in an instant, pulling him up. "Kor, stay with me." I can't." Kor's voice was barely a whisper. His eyes fluttered, his body refusing to cooperate. "Yes, you can," Ryker said firmly, lifting the Ragan back to his feet. "We're almost there, just a few more steps. Don't quit on me now." Kriv looked back at Kor, his own body screaming in protest, but he clenched his jaw and pushed forward, forcing his numb legs to keep moving. Zarn staggered beside him, his limbs stiff and unresponsive, but he too kept moving, fueled by Ryker's relentless determination. The station loomed larger now, close enough that they could see the details of the structure. Ryker kept a tight grip on Kor, practically carrying him as they trudged through the snow. The wind howled one last time before suddenly dying down as they reached the lee of the station's walls. "We made it," Ryker breathed, his breath turning to mist as he pushed open the half-frozen door. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lights. The temperature inside was still frigid, but it was sheltered from the wind, and most importantly, it was survivable. Ryker helped the others inside, each one collapsing to the floor, their bodies trembling violently as the adrenaline began to wear off. He sealed the door behind them, blocking out the worst of the storm. "Stay close. We need to warm up slowly. Too fast, and you'll shock your systems." Gura slumped against the wall, his fur-covered body shaking as he tried to catch his breath. You call that a minor annoyance?" Ryker chuckled softly, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Told you. We've dealt with worse back on Earth." Kriv looked at him through half-closed eyes, his body still shivering uncontrollably. "Worse than this? You humans really are something else?" Zarn let out a wheezing laugh, his mandibles clicking softly in disbelief. "I'll never doubt a human's resilience again." Ryker leaned back against the wall, a satisfied grin on his face. "Glad you've finally come around. Now let's get some heat going and make sure none of you turn into popsicles." The storm outside raged on, but inside the station, the cadets began to recover. Ryker, ever the comm anchor, began checking the old station systems, searching for a way to start the heaters. They had survived the worst of it, but the night was still far from over. The station's interior was dimly lit by the fading glow of emergency lights, casting long shadows across the frozen walls. Ryker stood in the center of the room, his breath still visible in the frigid air, as he inspected the control panel mounted on the far wall. His fingers, now thawing but stiff from the cold, flipped switches and pressed buttons, trying to coax the ancient system back to life. The heaters were silent, the air heavy with the chill that clung to everything. Behind him, the alien cadets huddled together, their bodies still trembling as the adrenaline from their near-death trek began to wear off. Kor had collapsed onto one of the metal benches, his feathers stiff with frost, while Zarn slumped against the wall, his mandibles clicking softly in an unconscious rhythm. Gura, the grox, sat with his back against the door, his massive frame still shaking as ice crystals melted off his fur. "This station looks like it hasn't been used in years," Ryker muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration as he scanned the malfunctioning system. No power to the heaters. The lights are barely holding on. He let out a frustrated breath, then turned to face the group. We'll need to find another way to stay warm until the storm passes. There's no way we're going back out there in this. Kor lifted his head, his eyes still heavy with exhaustion. How long will the storm last? His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but the fear in it was unmistakable. None of them were sure how much more their bodies could endure. Ryker crouched down in front of him, placing a reassuring hand on the Ragan's shoulder. Could be a few hours, could be the rest of the night. But don't worry. We've made it this far. We'll get through this too. Zarn's mandibles clicked nervously as he wrapped his cloak tighter around himself. What if the storm doesn't stop? We're already at our limits, Ryker. Our suits are barely functional. In this station, it's not much better. The human gave Zarn a small, confident smile. I'll figure something out. There's always a way. He stood up and began to rummage through the supplies scattered across the station. It was old and abandoned, but there were crates, some half covered in ice, and a few long-dead pieces of equipment. His eyes settled on a small stack of blankets and emergency kits tucked into a corner, partially buried under a pile of debris. Look at this, Ryker said, hauling the pile toward the group. Not much, but better than nothing. We'll wrap ourselves up, keep close, and conserve body heat. As Ryker began distributing the blankets, Gura growled lowly from his place against the door. I don't get it, human. Why aren't you more worried? We're trapped, freezing, and that storm out there could bury us alive. You talk like we're just waiting for a little rain to stop. Ryker paused for a moment, looking at the giant groks. He could see the fear behind the aliens' frustration. They all felt it, the gnawing dread that this station might be their tomb if the storm raged on too long. It's not that I'm not worried, Ryker said quietly, draping a blanket over Gura's broad shoulders. I've just learned that fear doesn't help. It gets into your head, makes you panic, and panic gets you killed faster than the cold ever will. Kor, half buried under his own blanket, shivered violently, but managed to ask, How? How do you deal with it, Ryker? The fear. Ryker sat down, resting his back against the icy wall. His eyes flickered for a moment, as if recalling memories he'd rather forget. You focus on what's in front of you. You focus on keeping your friends alive. The fear's still there, but it's just noise in the background. You don't let it make your choices. Zarn stared at him, his alien eyes wide. Is that something all humans learn? Or just you? Ryker chuckled softly, though the sound was tired, almost hollow. Depends on where you're from, I guess. Earth has some harsh lessons for those who survive there. You learn to keep moving, even when you're scared out of your mind. Gura grunted, shifting under his blanket. I thought my species was tough. We hibernate through the worst of our winters. But this, it's a new kind of hell. Ryker smiled wryly. Trust me, I'm not enjoying this either. But we'll survive. This is nothing compared to the worst Earth has to offer. The group fell silent for a few moments, the only sound the faint hum of the dying lights and the howling wind outside. Ryker glanced at the station's flickering control panel, hoping the storm would subside soon. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the station, followed by a thud. Ryker shot to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm strapped to his hip. What was that? The others snapped to attention, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Gura rose slowly, his massive frame casting a shadow over the room. Something outside? Ryker moved cautiously toward the door, his sharp eyes scanning the small cracks in the structure. Another creak, then a sharp crack reverberated through the building, as if something heavy was moving across the roof. Could be just the wind or something else, Ryker muttered, his hand tightening around the grip of his weapon. Kor stood, though his legs were shaky. The storm shouldn't be strong enough to break through the roof, right? Before Ryker could answer, a loud crash came from above, sending a shower of snow and debris through the ceiling. The group scattered, barely avoiding the cascade of ice that followed. Move! Ryker shouted, his eyes darting around for cover. They barely had time to react before another section of the ceiling buckled. And then, through the collapsing roof, they saw it, a massive, hulking shadow moving in the storm. Riker's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just the storm. Something was out there. Zarn's mandibles clicked rapidly, his eyes wide with panic. "What is that?" Ryker didn't answer. He had no idea what they were facing, but the creature's silhouette suggested one thing. It was big, and it wasn't friendly. Another deafening crash as the roof gave way completely, snow pouring into the room. Ryker pulled his weapon, instinct taking over. "Everyone, get behind me! Stay low!" The creature's shadow loomed larger, and with a roar that cut through the wind, it leaped down into the station. The cadets gasped in horror, their bodies frozen in shock. Riker's pulse quickened, but his hand was steady as he raised the gun. "This just got complicated," he muttered under his breath, narrowing his eyes at the beast. The freezing cold was no longer their only enemy. The creature's roar reverberated through the wrecked station, shaking what little remained of the walls. Snow and ice showered down as the massive shadow loomed larger, its shape barely discernible through the haze of white. Ryker stood his ground, the cold steel of his weapon steady in his grip. But even he couldn't ignore the rush of fear coursing through him. This thing, whatever it was, had found them, and it wasn't leaving until they were dead. Kor let out a shaky breath from behind Ryker, his feathers bristling. What do we do, Ryker?" "We survive," Ryker muttered, his voice calm but determined. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto the beast. "We've come too far to die in the cold now." The creature stepped into the dim light, revealing itself fully. It was massive, twice as tall as Gura, covered in thick, matted fur that bristled with frost. Its glowing eyes, eerily bright, glared at them with primal hunger. Huge claws dug into the floor, leaving deep gouges as it moved closer. Zarn let out a sharp, clicking noise of panic. That's not from this planet. What is that thing?" Gura grunted, his voice trembling as he stared up at the beast. "It doesn't matter. It's going to kill us if we don't do something." Ryker nodded, stepping back slightly and glancing at his teammates. They were worn, exhausted, and barely holding on after their journey through the storm. He couldn't let this monster finish what the cold had started. "Listen up," Ryker said, his voice commanding, even in the face of the creature. "We're not going down like this. Zarn, Kor, flank it. Stay low and hit it where it's vulnerable. Gura, you're with me. We're the distraction." Kor and Zarn exchanged nervous glances but nodded, their fear momentarily overridden by Riker's confidence. They moved cautiously, keeping low and circling around the creature, trying to stay out of its line of sight. Gura, still shaking with cold but filled with resolve, let out a low growl. "What's the plan, Ryker?" Ryker smirked, his breath visible in the freezing air. "We give it a fight it won't forget." With that, Ryker lunged forward, firing off a shot aimed at the beast's glowing eyes. The bullet hit its mark, and the creature roared in rage, staggering back. Gura, fueled by adrenaline, let out a war cry and charged, slamming his massive shoulder into the creature's side. The beast roared again, swiping at Gura with one of its massive claws, sending the Grox crashing into the wall. Ryker cursed under his breath, but didn't falter. He kept firing, trying to draw its attention away from the others. Kor and Zarn darted around the beast's flank, their alien agility allowing them to move quickly despite the cold. Kor slashed at the creature's legs with a blade from his kit, while Zarn, using his sharp mandibles, went for its exposed flank. The creature howled in pain, thrashing violently, but the cadets were relentless. Ryker fired another shot, this one hitting the creature's shoulder, while Gura, recovering from the blow, managed to pull himself up and charge again, tackling the creature head-on. For a brief moment, it looked like they might have the upper hand. But then the creature let out a deafening roar, its glowing eyes flaring with fury. It swiped at Kor, knocking him to the ground with a brutal strike, then turned its focus on Ryker. It charged faster than something of its size should have been able to move. Riker's heart raced as the creature barreled toward him. He fired again, but it barely slowed the beast. There was no time to dodge. And then, just as the creature's massive claws were about to tear into him, Gura hurled himself in front of Ryker, taking the full force of the blow. The Grox let out a guttural cry as the beast's claws slashed across his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. "No!" Ryker shouted, rushing to Gura's side as the creature turned its attention to Kor and Zarn, who were still trying to regroup. Gura was bleeding, his breath shallow. "You saved me," Ryker muttered, gripping Gura's shoulder. "Hang in there, buddy." Gura's eyes fluttered open, and he let out a weak laugh. "Just don't let it win." Ryker clenched his jaw, his mind racing. They were out of options. The creature was too strong, and they were all too weak. But Ryker knew one thing. They weren't going to die here. Not like this. He looked around the station, his eyes landing on the old equipment, the broken control panel, and then he saw it. A small fuel canister, half buried under some debris. It was risky, insanely risky, but it was their only shot. "Zarn! Kor!" Ryker shouted, grabbing the canister and yanking it free. "Get back now!" The two cadets didn't hesitate. They bolted toward the far side of the station, while the creature, confused by their sudden retreat, let out a low growl and started toward Ryker. Ryker lit the fuse on the canister, watching as the flame sputtered to life. "Come on, you ugly son of a—" Ryker didn't finish the sentence. He threw the canister as hard as he could at the advancing creature and dove behind a piece of debris, covering his head. For a split second, there was silence. Then, the canister exploded with a deafening boom, sending a shockwave through the station. Flames erupted, engulfing the creature in a blaze of light and heat. It howled in agony, thrashing wildly as the fire consumed it. Ryker dared to look up, watching as the beast's massive form collapsed, its roars fading into a final, desperate cry. The flames flickered for a moment longer before dying down, leaving nothing but the charred remains of the creature behind. The storm outside raged on, but inside the station, there was a stillness. The battle was over. Ryker slowly stood, his body aching, and looked around at his team. Gura, though badly injured, was still breathing. Kor and Zarn were shaken but alive. They had made it. Ryker let out a long breath, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He walked over to Gura, kneeling beside him. "You did good, Gura. You saved us." The Grox grunted weakly, a hint of pride in his voice. "We saved each other." Ryker smiled and looked out the broken ceiling, where the storm was beginning to lighten. The sky, though still gray, had a faint glimmer of dawn peeking through. "We survived," Ryker said quietly, as much to himself as to his team. "We always survive." The cold was still there, but it no longer felt like the enemy. They had faced worse, and won. As the first light of morning broke through the clouds, Ryker helped his teammates to their feet. Together, they limped toward the station's entrance, the fire from the explosion now a faint warmth behind them. They had survived the storm. They had survived the cold. And now they would survive anything.